Verses 1 to 3. The hour was now come that the captain of our salvation, who was to be made perfect by sufferings, should engage the enemy. We have here his entrance upon the encounter. The day of recompense is in his heart, and the year of his redeemed is come, and his own arm works the salvation, for he has no second. Let us turn aside now, and see this great sight. Our Lord Jesus, like a bold champion, takes the field first. v1:2 When he had spoken these words, preached the sermon, prayed his prayer, and so finished his testimony, he would lose no time, but went forth immediately out of the house, out of the city, by moonlight, for the Passover was observed at the full moon, with his disciples, the 11, for Judas was otherwise employed, and he went over the brook Cedron, which runs between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives, where was a garden. Not his own, but some friends, who allowed him the liberty of it. Observe that our Lord Jesus entered upon his sufferings when he had spoken these words, as Mt 26:1, when he had finished all these sayings. Here it is intimated that our Lord Jesus took his work before him. The office of the priest was to teach, and pray, and offer sacrifice. Christ, after teaching and praying, applies himself to make atonement. Christ had said all he had to say as a prophet, and now he addresses himself to the discharge of his office as a priest, to make his soul an offering for sin, and, when he had gone through this, he entered upon his kingly office. That having by his sermon prepared his disciples for this hour of trial, and by his prayer prepared himself for it, he then courageously went out to meet it. When he had put on his armor, he entered the lists, and not till then. Let those that suffer according to the will of God, in a good cause, with a good conscience, and having a clear call to it, comfort themselves with this, that Christ will not engage those that are his in any conflict, but he will first do that for them which is necessary to prepare them for it, and if we receive Christ's instructions and comforts, and be interested in his intercession, we may, with an unshaken resolution, venture through the greatest hardships in the way of duty. That he went forth with his disciples. Judas knew what house he was in the city, and he could have stayed and met his sufferings there, but he would do as he was wont to do, and not alter his method, either to meet the cross or to miss it, when his hour was come. It was his custom when he was at Jerusalem, after he had spent the day in public work, to retire at night to the Mount of Olives. There his quarters were, in the skirts of the city, for they would not make room for him in the palaces, in the heart of the town. This being his custom, he could not be put out of his method by the foresight of his sufferings, but, as Daniel did then just as he did aforetime, Dan 6:10. He was as unwilling that there should be an uproar among the people as his enemies were, for it was not his way to strive or cry. If he had been seized in the city, and a tumult raised thereby, mischief might have been done, and a great deal of blood shed, and therefore he withdrew. Note, when we find ourselves involved in trouble, we should be afraid of involving others with us. It is no disgrace to the followers of Christ to fall tamely. Those who aim at honor from men value themselves upon a resolution to sell their lives as dearly as they can, but those who know that their blood is precious to Christ, and that not a drop of it shall be shed but upon a valuable consideration, need not stand upon such terms. He would set us an example in the beginning of his passion, as he did at the end of it, of retirement from the world. Let us go forth to him, without the camp, bearing his reproach. Hebrew 13:13. We must lay aside, and leave behind, the crowds, and cares, and comforts, of cities, even holy cities, if we would cheerfully take up our cross, and keep up our communion with God therein. That he went over the brook Cedron. He must go over this to go to the Mount of Olives, but the notice taken of it intimates that there was something in it significant, and it points at David's prophecy concerning the Messiah, PS 110:7, that he shall drink of the brook in the way, the brook of suffering in the way to his glory and our salvation, signified by the brook Cedron, the black brook, so called either from the darkness of the valley it ran through or the color of the water, tainted with the dirt of the city. Such a brook Christ drank of, when it lay in the way of our redemption, and therefore shall he lift up the head. his own and ours. At David's pattern, as a type of the Messiah. In his flight from Absalom, particular notice is taken of his passing over the brook Cedron, and going up by the ascent of Mount Olivet, weeping, and all that were with him in tears too. 2 Sa. 15:23-30. The son of David, being driven out by the rebellious Jews, who would not have him to reign over them, and Judas, like Ahithophel, being in the plot against him, passed over the brook in meanness and humiliation, attended by a company of true mourners. The godly kings of Judah had burnt and destroyed the idols they found at the brook Cedron, Asa. 2 Chr 15:16, Hezekiah, 2 Chr 30:14, Josiah, 2 Key 23:4, 6. Into that brook the abominable things were cast. Christ, being now made sin for us, that he might abolish it and take it away, began his passion by the same brook. Mount Olivet, where Christ began his sufferings, lay on the east side of Jerusalem, Mount Calvary, where he finished them, on the west, for in them he had an eye to such as should come from the east and the west. That he entered into a garden. This circumstance is taken notice of only by this evangelist, that Christ's sufferings began in a garden. In the Garden of Eden sin began, there the curse was pronounced, there the Redeemer was promised, and therefore in a garden that promised seed entered the lists with the old serpent. Christ was buried also in a garden. Let us, when we walk in our gardens, take occasion thence to meditate on Christ's sufferings in a garden, to which we owe all the pleasure we have in our gardens, for by them the curse upon the ground for man's sake was removed. When we are in the midst of our possessions and enjoyments, we must keep up an expectation of troubles, for our gardens of delight are in a vale of tears. That he had his disciples with him, because he used to take them with him when he retired for prayer. They must be witnesses of his sufferings, and his patience under them, that they might with the more assurance and affection preach them to the world. Lu 24:48, and be themselves prepared to suffer. He would take them into the danger to show them their weakness, notwithstanding the promises they had made of fidelity. Christ sometimes brings his people into difficulties, that he may magnify himself in their deliverance. That Judas the traitor knew the place, knew it to be the place of his usual retirement, and probably, by some word Christ had dropped, knew that he intended to be there that night, for want of a better closet. A solitary garden is a proper place for meditation and prayer, and after a Passover is a proper time to retire for private devotion, that we may pray over the impressions made and the vows renewed, and clench the nail. Mention is made of Judas's knowing the place. To aggravate the sin of Judas, that he would betray his master, notwithstanding the intimate acquaintance he had with him, nay, and that he would make use of his familiarity with Christ, as giving him an opportunity of betraying him, a generous mind would have scorned to do so base a thing. Thus has Christ's holy religion been wounded in the house of its friends, as it could not have been wounded anywhere else. Many an apostate could not have been so profane, if he had not been a professor, could not have ridiculed scriptures and ordinances, if he had not known them. To magnify the love of Christ, that, though he knew where the traitor would seek him, thither he went to be found of him, now that he knew his hour was come. Thus he showed himself willing to suffer and die for us. What he did was not by constraint, but by consent, though as man he said, "Let this cup pass away," as mediator he said, "Lo, I come with a good will." It was late in the night, we may suppose 8 or 9 o'clock, when Christ went out to the garden, for it was not only his meat and drink, but his rest and sleep, to do the will of him that sent him. When others were going to bed, he was going to prayer, going to suffer. The captain of our salvation having taken the field, the enemy presently comes upon the spot, and attacks him. v3 Judas with his men comes thither, commissioned by the chief priests, especially those among them that were Pharisees, who were the most bitter enemies to Christ. This evangelist passes over Christ's agony, because the other three had fully related it, and presently introduces Judas and his company that came to seize him. Observe. The persons employed in this action a band of men and officers from the chief priests, with Judas. Here is a multitude engaged against Christ, a band of men, spira cohors, a regiment, a Roman band, which some think was 500 men, others 1,000. Christ's friends were few, his enemies many. Let us therefore not follow a multitude to do evil, nor fear a multitude designing evil to us, if God be for us. Here is a mixed multitude, the band of men were Gentiles, Roman soldiers, a detachment out of the guards that were posted in the tower of Antonia, to be a curb upon the city, the officers of the chief priests, high pretas. Either their domestic servants, or the officers of their courts, were Jews. These had an enmity to each other, but were united against Christ, who came to reconcile both to God in one body. It is a commissioned multitude, not a popular tumult. No, they have received orders from the chief priests, upon whose suggestion to the governor that this Jesus was a dangerous man, it is likely they had a warrant from him too to take him up, for they feared the people. See what enemies Christ and his gospel have had, and are likely to have, numerous and potent, and therefore formidable, ecclesiastical and civil powers combined against them. PS 2:1, 2. Christ said it would be so, Mt 10:18, and found it so. All under the direction of Judas. He received this band of men. It is probable that he requested it, alleging that it was necessary to send a good force, being as ambitious of the honor of commanding in chief in this expedition as he was covetous of the wages of this unrighteousness. He thought himself wonderfully preferred from coming in the rear of the contemptible 12 to be placed at the head of these formidable hundreds. He never made such a figure before, and promised himself, perhaps, that this should not be the last time, but he should be rewarded with a captain's commission, or better, if he succeeded well in this enterprise. The preparation they had made for an attack, they came with lanterns, and torches, and weapons. If Christ should abscond, though they had moonlight, they would have occasion for their lights, but they might have spared these. The second Adam was not driven, as the first was, to hide himself, either for fear or shame, among the trees of the garden. It was folly to light a candle to seek the sun by. If he should resist, they would have occasion for their arms. The weapons of his warfare were spiritual, and at these weapons he had often beaten them, and put them to silence, and therefore they have now recourse to other weapons, swords, and staves.